Hey everyone, this is Jono, and in today's video, we're going to talk about conflict resolution. Now, conflict is something that affects all communities, all businesses, all organizations when certain personalities kind of rub each other up the wrong way. And I'm going to talk about what conflict is, what causes it, and how you can resolve it. Let's get to it. Alrighty, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here. As usual, if you want to stay up to date with the very best in building amazing communities and teams, hit that subscribe button and then of course tap that little notification bell and we'll send you new videos when they come out. So this is the topic today, conflict resolution. Now this is something that a lot of people are quite interested in, but often not because they want to be, but because there are some personalities in their community who are causing problems, they're frustrating each other, and it's generating some conflict. And the problem with conflict is it can just, it generates a lot of tension, but it can kind of pull the vibe, the spirit of the community of your business down. So it's something you really want to deal with as quickly as possible, okay? Now, conflict is something that every organization, every human grouping, families, communities, businesses, everybody experiences this from time to time, okay? But what I want to go through in this video is what are the causes of conflict, and then what is the predictable set of steps that you can go through for how to resolve it. Now, conflict is one part of what I call the community challenges triangle. You know, these are three areas that typically will impact most communities, most organizations, and it's proportional, right? So up there you can see crisis management is the top. Thankfully, this tends to happen relatively rarely that you have a crisis to deal with. Conflict resolution is a little bit more common, and then by far the most common area here is stress and burnout. And I am recording videos on these other topics as well, so if they're out there, I haven't done them yet, go and check them out. Okay, now in this video we're going to be talking about conflict resolution, and this is something that I have quite a bit of experience in over the course of my career, both when I've been running communities and when I've been helping clients to build their communities and run their communities. You know, we've had to deal with many different types of conflicts. But I do want to provide one quick caveat here, is that conflict varies enormously in context, in people, in tonality, in how you should react to it, okay? So what I'm providing here is a general set of guidelines, but you should always make sure that you're applying these guidelines to your specific situation. There is no silver bullet. There is no single playbook for how to deal with a conflict scenario. One of the key elements that I want to get across in this video is it's all about listening to what's going on, understanding the patterns that's driving it, and then providing practical solutions to resolve those specific patterns, okay? The other caveat that I want to provide before I go on is that I'm presuming that this conflict is a non-violent conflict that's occurring. I'm going to presume that this isn't related to racism, transphobia, sexism, all of that kind of nasty stuff. You may need to apply a set of principles, a set of approaches that are way beyond this in dealing with those kinds of situations. So what I'm talking about here is when you're typically dealing with just personalities who are kind of rubbing up against each other in a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like a non-productive manner, I guess is the best way I could describe it. So let's first of all get into what are the causes of conflict? Well, there's a number of different causes that can generate conflict, okay? One of them is unclear expectations. I see this all of the time, okay? Let's say you've got two people and they're working on the same project, and one of those people was supposed to deliver a piece of work on the Wednesday and they deliver it a week late, okay? But the other person was expecting that it was going to be done on that Wednesday, and maybe this expectation was made clearly, maybe it wasn't. If it wasn't made clearly, maybe they assumed and they jumped to conclusions about this. And if there's one thing that we human beings do all the time is we assume too much, you know? We jump to conclusions. We often see, you know, three pieces of data, and then we draw a conclusion from the data that we've got available to us. And sometimes those conclusions are just inaccurate, because often when we're evaluating those kinds of data points, we often roll in kind of our opinions about it. If you want a classic example of this, just look at politics, right? You can take, you know, for example, you know, the leader of the Republicans can say something, and a bunch of people who are more on the Democratic side will assume all kinds of ill intent in that person's words. And the same happens on the other side. When the leader of the Democrats says something, then more conservative people will read all kinds of ill intent in that as well. So one of the things that we do want to do in our strategy here is to really get to the heart of what expectations were set. And if unclear expectations is a cause here, how can we make sure that the way in which people work together, we have some clarity of expectations that have been defined there, okay? So as I'm going through these causes, really we want to be thinking about what the opposite of this. What are the inverse elements that we can put in place to deal with this? If there's unclear expectations, how do we define expectations more clearly? Now, another area that can often cause conflict are communication issues. Now, this can be broken down into a few different pieces. One is that we as human beings have varying degrees of competency when it comes to communicating, right? I've worked with many people over the years who are amazingly clear, concise, focused, pragmatic communicators, and those people are a pleasure to work with. But there are also some people out there who use very kind of strong, inflamed, often exaggerated language to describe often fairly menial and kind of boring situations, okay? So we all communicate in different ways, you know? Just look at the difference, for example, between someone like Donald Trump, who is currently the president of the United States as I record this video, and someone like Barack Obama, who was obviously the previous president. These two presidents have got very, very different styles. You know, Trump is bombastic and loud and kind of at times quite obnoxious, and Obama was often very measured and at times muted and very careful in the way that he picked his words. These are two very, very different communication styles, and consequently, you know, sometimes people's styles can rub up in a negative way, and sometimes people can just not understand each other very well. The other element to bear in mind with communication issues is the language that you're speaking in. I've seen many cases over the years with international communities and international businesses where somebody's been getting very, very frustrated at a communications issue, but English is the second language of somebody. And there are sometimes, you know, when English is someone's second language, they can say things in a fairly inarticulate way because they're speaking in a second language. I always try to cut a certain amount of slack to people who are speaking in a second language, and that's the primary mode of communication, which for me is English, because I don't speak any other languages. The only other language I speak is love. Okay. Well, that's your one time when you can throw up in your own mouths. You're welcome. So anyway, communication issues is definitely a cause. The other one here can be uncertainty. This is huge, right? Is that psychologically as creatures, we need safety is probably the most critical thing that we look for, right? It's the most critical thing that any political leader can focus on. It's the most critical thing that we look for with our families, with our home environments, with our work environments, is we need a sense of safety. When you feel like that safety is compromised in some way, that can often result in uncertainty, okay? And we might not be talking about physical safety, right? For example, you may be in a job and you're physically very, very safe, but let's say for the sake of argument, you don't particularly know whether you're doing a good job. You don't get a lot of validation from your boss. You don't know if your work is respected. That can generate uncertainty. There can be uncertainty if you're a member of a community and let's say there's a company who's investing in it and you're worried that they may be investing in the community with the wrong intentions and that ultimately at some point this is going to cause some future problems. That can generate uncertainty. Now, you know how we're kind of like inverting these pieces? The opposite of uncertainty is certainty, and this is one of the most critical elements of solving conflict, is that we identify where the uncertainty lives and we provide absolute clarity in dealing with that. Often with many companies that I've worked with where you've had frustrated employees, for example, it's because they haven't had all the information available to them, and then what happens is people get frustrated, they get annoyed, and then this becomes kind of like it becomes like a big ball of uncertainty that gets bigger and bigger and bigger because, you know, often uncertainty can then fuel paranoia and that can cause all kinds of challenges, okay? Now, another big cause of conflict can be power imbalances. And this is something that just happens in the world as we just generally live in the world. There's power imbalances everywhere, right? So for example, when you go for a job interview, right? The person who's doing the interview, who's on the opposite side of the interview table, if you're going for the job, they typically will have the power, right? They often take control of the situation. And one thing that I guide people when they are kind of learning to get a new job or they're focusing on switching careers is to reseat that power dynamic. You know, I have a training course that I released for community managers, which is how to get your dream community job. And one of the things I spend a lot of time on in that course is making sure that you go into that interview and you equalize that power balance, because it shouldn't be they have all the power because they're giving the job away or they've got the job that you're interested in. This is about finding a good fit, right? You have every right to say no to them as they have to say no to you. So that's where we equalize the power, and then that can often make the interview, for example, a lot easier. Whether power imbalances in any element of society, it can often cause a lot of consternation. We've seen, obviously, this is very significant when it comes to things like civil rights Underrepresented groups, untapped groups, minorities have often experienced power imbalances for many years, and that can cause an awful lot of frustration and conflict as a result of that. So when we're looking in our conflict situation, we want to see what is the power imbalance. Is there, for example, a conflict between a manager and a subordinate, or a long-time community member and somebody who's brand new to the community? And then equalizing that can often help as well. And then finally, I think a huge cause of conflict can be cultural differences. And I don't mean this necessarily in a mendicious way. I don't mean this as people being racist and ignorant towards other cultures. There is certainly an element of that in some communities and in some businesses. And you want to put a stop to that right away, because that's an incredibly toxic perspective to have. Do not tolerate, obviously, any kind of racism or transphobia or sexism or any of that kind of nasty stuff, okay? What I'm talking about is the lives that we've grown up with can often influence the way in which we communicate and the actions that we take with other people. So I'll give you a classic, very personal example of this. I've been married to my wife, Erica, now, as I record this video, for about 12 years. And we've had a wonderful marriage so far. I expect it to continue being wonderful. But one of the things that we love about our marriage is that she was raised in the Bay Area. And she was raised in what I would call a middle to upper class area. She is not a snooty woman in any way, shape or form, but she grew up around people who had like nice cars and, a lot of executives working in different positions, and, people would go to like Tahoe skiing, and, I don't begrudge her that life at all. It's awesome, right? And I would want that for anyone's kids. Now, I grew up, especially in my earlier years, in a more of a working class environment. We didn't have a huge amount. And, I grew up, for example, in England, what we call council housing, which is kind of the same as government housing. And then, my dad got a new job, and then gradually his career started growing, and we moved to a village, and we became a bit more middle class, right? But what's interesting is that the only times where Eric and I have sometimes had a bit of conflict is where my cultural background has kind of rubbed up a little bit against her cultural background, right? So, for example, there's been times where, we've made a decision for our son, right, about buying him something. And at times I felt like we shouldn't buy him that because I feel like it's setting the wrong kind of expectation. And that's because when I was his age, I didn't have that, right? And then I worry about him becoming like a little, snobby rich kid. And that becomes a fear that is an insecurity in myself that I'm then projecting into my family, which is obviously not okay. So sometimes what I'm saying here is that when we do have these like little minor spats, and a spat for Eric and I is a minor disagreement, and then she tells me I'm being stupid and I agree with her, and then life is good again. She's annoyingly right about pretty much everything. And I'm trying to put a stop to it, but I've not been successful so far. But anyway, what happens is the general cause of these issues, when I look into it and I look into the conflict, it's just our different cultural backgrounds. And we can see this all over the place. Like people grow up in different countries, in different faiths, different perspectives, different approaches to problem solving. Not everybody comes from the same background. One example is a guy who used to be in a community that I used to be involved in, and he was an incredibly acerbic member of a team. Like he was very, very kind of aggressive, and just sometimes had a bit of a bad attitude. And one time I was hanging out with him in a bar, and I plucked up the courage to basically say, look, man, what are you doing? Like, you're developing a little bit of a reputation here. And he just said, like, I never grew up around computers. I didn't particularly grow up around people who were in the information space. Like I have a lot of people who were primarily, going to work in a factory and involved in manual labor and things like that. I just don't have any background and any experience in this level of kind of like building new things and problem solving in a technology space. And I think sometimes I just take the wrong approach. And again, that was an example of a cultural difference. So it's not just necessarily, people from Germany working with people from Morocco, and people from the United States working with people from France. It can sometimes be our cultural background gives us a certain level of experience and a certain level of expertise, and that can be very different with different people from different areas, okay? So that's just something you want to bear in mind. As a general rule, when you've got people from very, very different backgrounds, especially from multiple countries, I think you always want to be on the lookout for, first of all, is their intent malicious, right? I always look at this like, is somebody intentionally trying to be difficult? Are they intentionally trying to be problematic? And thankfully, most times they're not. So therefore, what are the reasons behind that? Is it because there's a power imbalance? Is it because they come from a different cultural background? Is it because they lack a certain set of skills or a certain set of expertise? These are the kind of things that you want to explore when you're evaluating the cause of a conflict situation. So now, how do we resolve it? Let's get into that. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, you've got two people and they're bickering with each other. They're working on the same project. Let's say let's, for the sake of argument, say this is in a company and it's the head of marketing and the head of community, right? And this is actually quite common. Sometimes you'll have these kind of personality conflicts can occur, especially within roles like that are kind of similar, but not exactly the same, okay? So this is how I would recommend you go through it. This is a multi-step approach. The first thing you want to do is to be a facilitator. And what I mean by that is, let's say these two people, let's say it's Mark and Jane, right? Mark is the marketing person, and Jane is the community person. What I would want to do as another member of the organization is to kind of come in and say, hey, I think we're having some challenges here. And, I think I'm noticing a lot of tension, and I know it's probably not enjoyable for either of you. I'd like to figure out a way in which I can help resolve this. It's just an independent third party. And what's critical about being a facilitator is you need to go in there as an objective third party. If you go in there and Mark feels like, okay, this is Jono's obviously Jane's friend, so Jono's obviously going to side with Jane, then this is not going to be good, and vice versa if Jane thinks the same thing about Mark. So we need to be objective, okay? And I think what you do is you reach out to both people independently and you say, hey, I just want to help. Like, I have no dog in this race. I often say that. I've got no dog in this race. I just want to figure out a way in which I can be helpful so we can rectify this situation. Okay? Now, the next step is that you understand the issues and the personalities involved. So what I would recommend you do is you organize a call with Mark and with Jane, or in your case, whoever is involved in the community, and you just go into listening mode and just say, hey, I'd just like you to tell me what's going on, okay? And let's say I'm talking to Mark, and Mark will almost certainly just start just blasting Jane, right? Like, she does this and she does this. In many cases, when you have this initial call, people are just venting. They're getting it off their chest. And a lot of this is just emotion speaking, right? And what you want to do is listen. And as you're listening to it, you're going to play a little bit of like a CSI Miami kind of role, right? This is all the material that's coming out of their mouths. And you want to zoom in and enhance, like on CSI, and try to find what are the underlying principles that are causing this. So let's say Mark says, Jane is just constantly complaining that my work is not good enough, right? Now, that sounds like emotion to me. But what that also tells me is that Jane's expectations of Mark's work and what good means is going to be different to what Mark's expectations of what good means to him. So that might be able to be a little area where we can kind of have a little bit of clarity on what does success look like? What does good mean, or what does done mean with individual bits of a particular project, okay? So let's say, now I'm having the conversation with Jane, and Jane's saying, you know what? I don't mind Mark. Like, he seems like a nice enough guy, but he's constantly late. He never gets his stuff done on time. And then what happens is, we're left holding the baby and we've got to try and figure out what to do, Now, that is a little bit more measured feedback, which I'd expect from Jane, because I like Jane. She seems very friendly. Mark, I don't like Mark. I'm just kidding. Remember, objective third-party facilitator. Don't do what I just did. Anyway, so why do I even make these videos? Why would you listen to me? So anyway, let's say Jane says that. Now, what that would tell me is, again, that there may be an element of setting expectations around work, when work should be done, or what done looks like. And this is often a very common problem in projects where someone says, okay, I will take over the task of setting up the website. And, setting up the website could be putting one page on the internet, or it could be setting up a complete WordPress site with, multiple blogs and posts and SEO and all kinds of complicated stuff. So maybe that's one area where we can kind of identify, again, a common level of agreement and understanding in that particular area. So when you interview each of these people separately, let them get it off their chest, expect a lot of emotion, but look for those underlying issues. That's what you want to focus on, because that's going to be the backbone of your conflict resolution strategy. Now, also, while you're on these calls, what you're also going to be doing is building trust with them, okay? Now, what you don't want to do is misrepresent yourself. Like, so when Jane, for example, is providing feedback about Mark, don't be constantly saying, yeah, I agree, like he always does that. Yeah, I agree with that as well. You want to be fairly stoic. You don't want to say too much stuff like that, because the goal here is we don't want anyone to feel like you're picking sides. And what's really important, that I should have mentioned when I started talking about this particular bullet point, is you have to do this on a rich medium. You cannot do this via email. You cannot do it via Slack. You cannot do it via text messaging. You got to get on a phone call, a video call, you know, some kind of digital Skype conversation, whatever it might be. It's got to be a medium in which they can hear your voice. And that's really, really important, because what you want to do is you want to de-escalate the tension and the emotion. And one way of doing that is when they can hear your voice, so much more information comes out about what we're saying. Like, I'm talking to you right now, and you're listening to the words, you're listening to the information that I'm sharing about conflict resolution, but you're also listening to the tonality. Like, I'd like you to think that, you know, I'm speaking in a very kind and thoughtful way. That's certainly the impression I want you to take away, because that's, I'd like to think, how I am. And you're also going to be evaluating my body language and like how I'm kind of using my hands and gestures and things like that. So this is really important. Make sure that you have that call where they can at least hear your voice. Ideally, there's video as well. Now what you're going to do is you're going to hopefully have a big list of all of these things that you've taken away when you were listening to, you know, Mark and Jane, or in your case, you may have to talk to multiple different people. There may be 4 or 5 people involved in this particular conflict scenario. But you're going to take away all of these things. And what's going to happen is you're going to see some commonalities, right? You're going to see, you probably write down, you know, maybe 6 or 7 areas, but you'll probably see some commonalities that will probably map to some of the things we talked about earlier on. Like, some of these expectations are unclear, or there's some kind of poor communication decisions being made here. But those are the root causes. Again, this is going to be the backbone of how you rectify and resolve this situation. So just to recap, at this point, you've had one conversation with both of them individually, and you've just let them vent, and you've taken away and written down these root causes. And what you want to do is you want to think, what are the 2 or 3 main root causes that you think are resulting in this kind of conflict? Very rarely, in fact, I've never ever seen a situation where the conclusion I've taken is they just hate each other. I've never ever taken that view, because I just don't believe that's the case. 9 times out of 10, there are specific issues that when you rectify them, you know, they're probably not going to be best buddies and hanging out with each other. I'm not expecting Mark and Jane to be, you know, barbecuing together anytime soon, but they will be able to have an amenable working relationship. Now, the next step is that you then take those root causes and you just think privately, what are some tractable solutions that we can apply to mitigate these root causes, right? So remember when I was going through the causes of, many of the causes of conflict, I mentioned that we invert them. So like if one of the problems is a lack of clear expectations, then what we do is we say, how do we assure very clear expectations? Maybe we have a central project, or we have, you know, regular reports, or we have, you know, stand-up calls, or whatever it might be to deal with that. You look at those root causes, you invert them, and then say, what is a super simple thing that I can do, that I can propose to rectify this? Okay, so just note those things down yourself. And the goal here is that you want to kind of come away with at least 2 or 3 really practical, very, very simple solutions. Now, what you shouldn't do here is come up with really complicated processes. So, okay, so you've got this conflict. Here's a 10-step process that you're both going to have to kind of go through. It's not going to work. It's going to be too much. It's going to be too complicated. You want them to feel like a very, very small adjustment is going to have a huge impact in resolving this tension, right? I'll give you a tiny example, and this is completely nothing to do with conflict resolution. But one of my favorite things that I've discovered recently that my wife Erica introduced me to is something called intermittent fasting. So recently I injured my tailbone. I picked our son up, and he's getting quite big and heavy now, and something went crack in my tailbone, and it's been getting better, right? But for a long time, I couldn't really exercise because it would really hurt if I got on like a bike, a Peloton bike, or, went for a run or something along those lines. And my wife introduced me to this notion called intermittent fasting. And the basic idea is you don't have breakfast, you have lunch at noon, and then you have dinner, but after 8 p.m. you don't eat anything until the following day, and then at noon you have lunch. And given the fact that I've not been able to exercise a lot, it's a very, very small change in my life, and it's generated, it's helped me to keep relatively the same weight that I've always been, and I'm still drinking beer and eating takeout and all kinds of stuff, okay? Your mileage may vary. I'm not advocating for intermittent fasting here, but my point is a very, very small, simple solution had a big impact on my life, okay? And that's what we want to look at here. Sometimes, for example, if there's an issue with setting expectations, just having a small way in which you maybe track agreements or track next steps in a document, that can be enough and it can rectify that particular problem. So propose those tractable solutions. And what you're then going to do is you're then going to organize a call with everybody involved. So you'll bring Mark and Jane on. Make sure you get on that call first. Never be late to that call. Because can you imagine how awkward it is? You organize like a Zoom session, right? Mark shows up. Jane shows up about the same sort of time. And then for 5 minutes later, you come running in with your tail between your legs. And they've been awkwardly making chit chat for that 5 minutes. So you've got to show up first, okay? But what happens is you get on the call. And then what you first of all want to do is just thank them both. Say, thank you so much for the calls that we had. I really appreciate how frank and honest you were. What you first of all want to say is, it's obvious to me that you're both great people. You offer so much to our community or to our business. We really love the work that you're doing. And the good news is that I think I found some areas in our discussions of some tangible things that we can resolve. And what you do is you summarize some of those root causes. So you could say, for example, I've just noticed that sometimes in some of the things that you shared, some of the expectations were not particularly clear, or maybe there was some communication kind of misunderstandings. And what you do is you don't tell them what they said, you don't point fingers at all, but you summarize those root causes, and they will almost certainly be able to say, at least privately in their own minds, no, I see that, I understand that. And they may say that out loud too. And then what you do is you say, look, I had a couple of ideas about how we might be able to resolve this, and you share your tractable solutions. And what I mean by tractable is you can measure it, okay? It's something that you can see the results of. So it could be sharing the same document where you plan workout, or it could be, let's agree to these 3 principles when we're communicating with each other, something along those lines, okay? And then what you do is you document it. You write these things down. You say, okay, these are the things that we've agreed to, and you drop them in email. Don't put this into a big Google Doc or a Coda Doc or anything too complicated like that. Just put it down into an email and say, hey, these are the root, first of all, thank you for the great discussion. I'm really happy about this. These are the root causes. Here's the next steps that we're going to do. And then why don't we check in a couple of months and see how we're doing? And then leave it at that and let them go along and focus on those different pieces. And at that point, you have now put in place an appropriate conflict resolution strategy. Almost every single time that I've ever been through this process, when you have that call, generally they leave and they're like, yeah, that sounds good. It's very calm. And often you'll sometimes even find them exchanging a few little pleasantries with each other towards the end because they realize this was completely avoidable. Like we could have dealt with this, but they were too close to the flame. And then what you do is you check in, check in and, check in with them like a couple of months later and see how things are going. Maybe check in with them individually from time to time and just say like, how are you doing with the solutions that we kind of discussed? If there's any, sometimes some people will kind of regress a little bit, and then you need to have a little word with them and say, hey, can we just try and stick to what we agreed to? But as a general rule, this will resolve most of the conflict that I've ever seen. So anyway, that's it. I hope you found this useful. I know it's a longish video, but I think it's a really important topic. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Like, what do you think? What other things can we do to help resolve conflict? Have you applied this kind of approach? What do you think works well? What do you think doesn't work well? What recommendations would you have? I'd love to hear that. And of course, don't forget, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, and I'll see you on the other side.